حتى حسام لا يعملوا بقى شافوا بس طبعا يعني هم الناس
Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the panel focusing on accelerating to net zero in the new energy paradigm. I congratulate all of you who are here at the closing days of COP27. For many of you who've been to other COP events, you know that this is the time that we get particularly tired because we've been engaged in so many fantastic conversations. So thank you very, very much for taking the time to attend this session. My name is Nancy Gills. I'm from the World Economic Forum. I'm the program head of something called the First Movers Coalition, and I'll mention that in my opening comments a little bit later. But I'm here to welcome you to this session. Let me share with you what this session will be containing. We are excited to have, as you see behind me, two opening speakers. We've got Ms. Mary Warlick from IEA, who will be opening the session with a number of comments. She will then be followed by Mr. Eric Usher from the UNEP Finance Initiative, also similarly giving some opening comments. We will then be welcoming up a panel, and that panel will be addressing a number of questions focusing on how do we actually address those harder to abate sectors, what are some of the policy and finance mechanisms that we should be deploying, and now that we're coming to the close of COP27, what do we need to get done to make sure that COP28 is actually successful? So we'll have the panel speak to those topics, and then we will welcome up actually a closing speaker. And we're excited to have Mr. Claudio Facchin from Hitachi Energy, the CEO, come and actually talk to us about what is the role of technology to enable the reduction of greenhouse gases in those industrial sectors known as harder to abate. And hopefully with those closing comments, we'll have had a fantastic panel. Your time will be well spent. And we'll go ahead and exit because there's so much more still to participate in here at COP27. So without further ado, let me go ahead and start with welcoming Ms. Mary Warlick up to the stage for some introductory comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to join you here today. This topic is actually really very near and dear to the IEA, and it's one that we've been working on really quite deeply over the last couple of years. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and to begin by giving you a few highlights on this topic that are included in our latest 2022 World Energy Outlook report, which the IEA just recently released. And in that report, we grapple with what is really the central question. Will the current energy crisis help or hinder the move towards more sustainable and resilient energy systems? And there's no doubt the crisis is leaving devastating scars on the global economy. I think we all recognize that, especially in developing economies where the number of people without access to electricity is in fact very unfortunately set to rise for the first time in over 2 decades. And this crisis is also contributing to a temporary surge in coal use in some regions. However, in the long run, we think it's also leading towards an acceleration of the clean energy transition, and this is what's crucially important. Many governments around the world have already mobilized unprecedented levels of investment support for clean energy, which are set to nearly double the annual clean energy investment by 2030 and lead to a peak in fossil fuel demand within this decade, a first in our stated policy scenario. And this is really major progress since the Paris Agreement. We estimate that concrete actions being taken by government, industry, and civilians have already shaved 1 degree of warming off a pre-Paris Agreement emission trajectory, and this gives us hope. Of course, we need to go much faster, further to reach net zero emissions by 2050 in the energy sector. There's no question with regard to that. But the momentum we're already beginning to see is driving the energy industry to lay plans for a massive ramp-up that's nearly aligned with what would be needed for a net zero trajectory. For instance, announcements for new solar PV manufacturing capacity would already surpass what is needed by 2030 in our net zero scenario, while the announced scale up for EV battery manufacturing falls short by only 15%. But amidst even these promising developments, one major gap remains unaddressed. There is still far too little investment support for clean energy financing flowing to developing economies. And since the pandemic, advanced economies have committed over $1 trillion to support clean energy investment within their own borders, while developing economies with far less fiscal leeway continue to face setbacks and really struggle to keep basic energy affordable. We need to find enduring solutions to support rising levels of clean energy investments in the developing world if we are to reach our collective climate ambitions. One such solution is the Cost of Capital Observatory, which the IEA launched with the World Economic Forum. And the observatory provides insights which are really crucial to lowering the cost of financing clean energy in the developing world, where the cost of capital can be 7 times higher than advanced economies. So this difference can nearly double the cost of solar PV in developing markets. And addressing this global imbalance has been central to the conversations at COP this week. So I hope we can see outcomes that squarely address this pressing issue and really double down in focusing on it. The IEA stands ready to support any such efforts with all partners, and I'm sure that many of our colleagues here today are committed to doing so as well. So once again, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you, and we really look forward to greater collaboration on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those opening comments. And as was noted, there is significant focus on what is the role of technology, what is the role of finance, what is the role of policy, and we are welcome to hear another set of perspectives. Here I'd like to ask to the stage Mr. Eric Usher, as mentioned from UNEP Finance Initiative, to share a little bit about the financial perspective.
Thanks very much, Nancy, and good morning, everyone. And yeah, we're getting towards the end what we hope will be a successful COP, but there's still certainly a lot to do. I'm going to go into 4 key messages. First of all, when it comes to energy, getting to net zero emissions, it needs to go hand in hand with increasing access to energy. I think that is clear, and particularly the case on the continent where we're doing the negotiations this time. You know, the energy challenge, it really presents us with a complex dual challenge. On the one hand, emissions from the energy sector are contributing to ever-rising atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, so intensifying green climate impacts. UNEP's 2022 emissions gap report has pointed out that the world is still falling short of the Paris climate goals, and there's really no credible pathway to 1.5 degrees Celsius in place as of yet. On the other hand, we need to end energy poverty. You know, despite significant progress if nothing changes, an estimated 660 million people will still lack access to electricity in 2030, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa. 660 million, that's an incredible number. It's hard to believe for most people who take it for granted, having access to modern energy forms. So to provide energy equity and connectivity for all, we have to rapidly expand access to modern forms of energy and the services it makes possible. And this will mean more greenhouse gases and more pain if we follow current energy models. So we do have a solution to meet both of these goals. We need to expand access to energy and cut emissions at the same time. And we can do this if we adopt approaches based on a principle, net zero energy for all, roughly. So my second message is that getting to net zero emissions, it's certainly as urgent as ever. And to stabilize global mean temperature increase, we need to reach a point in which we are no longer growing the concentration of GHGs in the atmosphere. And to limit global mean temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees by 2100, we need to reach the point of net zero emissions by no longer than 2050. I think something you all know well. If this needs to happen fully in tandem with a commitment to keep cumulative emissions over time within the 1.5 carbon budget. So this applies at the level of the global economy, but in the short term, we can expect emissions to increase in developing countries that are expanding access. Eventually, though, all actors, countries, subnational governments, corporations, financial institutions, and individuals must get individually to net zero. My third message, net zero energy for all can be achieved, but we need governments, industry, and the financial sector pulling together. Making sure that the world's financial sector, the one that within UNEP-FI we work specifically with, making sure that it, including the world's institutional investors, the banks, the insurers, and all the enabling actors, the lawyers, the accountants, the stock exchanges, they all have to be at the table credibly and committed. And this is the aim of the Net Zero Financial Sector Alliances. At UNEP-FI, we convene 3 of them, all under the umbrella of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Specifically, we work with the first such alliance, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which actually predates GFANZ, the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, and the largest by many measures, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and also I think the most relevant to the developing world, where banking has a very large role within the financial system. Them getting to net zero is a key to getting the global economy to net zero. You can't really do one without the other. And this is not easy, but it can be done. It needs to be done. And I think in some instance, it is starting to be done. Financial institutions, they need to ensure that their portfolios become aligned and consistent with a 1.5 degree emissions pathway so that the cumulative emissions that they are associated with remain within the overall carbon budget. Now, we're seeing some promising actions and progress from these alliances. Last week, you may have seen that the Net Zero Banking Alliance announced here at COP that nearly half of its members, the first half who signed up, over 60 major global banks with totaling $50 trillion in assets, that they have now issued their first science-based intermediate portfolio level targets for priority sectors. And you can find online, you just Google NESBA Progress Report. These are priority sectors where they are most exposed to greenhouse gas emissions for achievement by 2030. That's their first interim milestone. Now, many of these targets cover banks' exposures critically to oil and gas and power generation, and are consistent with a 1.5 compatible GHG pathway at no or low overshoot. So essentially what is the highest level of decarbonization ambition. To give you some examples, the average of the bank's power generation targets is 54% reductions by 2030, cutting emissions in half in 8 years. In the oil and gas sector, I believe it's 32%, so a third reduction. So these are significant. Meanwhile, in September, 2 months back, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which I mentioned was the first such alliance, announced that 2/3 of its members, so 44 large investors, have now set intermediate science-based targets. So that is $7.1 trillion in assets under management that are under a science-based decarbonization target for attainment not by 2030, but 2025. 3 years from now. They got started a little bit earlier. And once again, the targets are consistent. The IPCC's 1.5 compatible GHG pathways at no overshoot, using no low overshoot scenarios. Now, the asset owner members total 10 trillion. They've set targets for 7. You asked the question, what about the other 3? Well, there are certain asset classes like sovereign bonds where we don't yet have the methodologies about how to set targets, but they're working on that. So they are coming up to try to cover the entirety of what they do. My fourth and final message, setting the right public policy targets and implementing the division are the tasks that really lie ahead. And I think one challenge lies in ensuring the continued credibility of these net zero commitments and their implementation. And at the UN, our role in these private sector alliances has been to help build and ensure collective target setting, the accountability and transparency frameworks that are sound, credible, transparent, well-governed, and most importantly, that are science-based. Each alliance has strict accountability mechanisms, and the recent recommendations from the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group on net zero commitments, the one chaired by Catherine McKenna, further has pointed to the areas in these alliances that have to and will be strengthened. Now, another challenge is that public policy frameworks are not aligned with the net zero transition. Large financial institutions, they are powerful economic actors, but they cannot act single-handedly or in opposition to their governments. They cannot deliver the net zero economy on their own. So through these alliances, financial institutions are doing their commensurate part in the transition. But an important step there is the translation of the long-term aspirational ambition of net zero by 2050 into concrete, quantitative, shorter-term targets that are operational and arguably aligned with a long-term objective. So while, as mentioned, these alliance members are doing that, they're taking the first steps, many governments are failing to do the same. And as we know through the emissions gap report, their shorter-term plans and targets, as captured in the NDCs, do not live up to and are misaligned with countries' longer-term ambitions by 2050. This needs to change. At this point, countries should be doing what financial institution members in these alliances are doing themselves. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rusher, for having given those comments. And it's always a challenge to hear both good news and still the challenge in front of us as you open a panel discussion. But that's really setting the scene, and that's what the panel will be addressing. As I mentioned, I'm Nancy Gills. I'm with the World Economic Forum, and we ourselves are very committed to helping our members and broadly the world at large address how do we actually bring abatement to what we like to call the harder to abate sectors, especially those that are impacted the most by climate change, i.e., of course, developing and emerging economies. And with that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the 3 initiatives that we are undertaking and share that information with you. One of them, of course, Mary Warlick had already mentioned. This was the Cost of Capital Observatory that we've worked together on. But I also want to talk a little bit about the initiative that I have the pleasure of leading, the First Movers Coalition, and then give you a little bit of information about the Net Zero Industry Tracker, which is mentioned as well. So let me pivot to, I think we have some slides that talk about the 3 separate initiatives. Let me first give you an introduction to the First Movers Coalition. As I mentioned, I'm the program head for that. We were very gratified to have an event at the start of COP27 that really focused on our success to date. So what is the First Movers Coalition? Rather quickly, it's an initiative that's bringing together private sector companies to really use their demand for clean energy technologies to drive those forward. And these are technologies that have been identified in our partnership with the Mission of Possible Partnership, have been identified as necessary to really bring down the emissions within these harder to abate sectors. And by those I mean material sectors such as steel, cement and concrete, aluminum, chemicals, and also long-range transportation such as aviation, shipping, and trucking. And what we are trying to do in leveraging private sector demand is bring those technologies that are existing but not yet at scale and currently carrying a new technology premium forward faster. And so for more information about that, you can always come to the World Economic Forum website, and we have currently launched the majority of the sectors that I just mentioned. We launched the cement and concrete sector here at COP27, very proud to do so, and we'll be launching our chemical sector next year. But the First Movers Coalition is just one initiative that the World Economic Forum is proud to be part of. We, of course, do this initiative in partnership with the U.S. government, the Office of Secretary Kerry, the Special Envoy for Climate Change, but as well are joined by 9 additional government partners. So the First Movers Coalition truly is a global initiative. But we also are here to mention to you the Net Zero Industry Tracker. Here, this is another initiative very proudly supported by the World Economic Forum. It tracks the progress of heavy industries to net zero, utilizing a common framework, a set of standard metrics and methodology, and looking not only at the different layers of emissions, but also the readiness of enablers necessary for the transformation. So you'll see here the slide shows the status of the enablers across policy, finance, technology, infrastructure, and demand, and across heavy industries. And it highlights the gaps therein. So substantial progress on industrial decarbonization can only be unlocked by improving the enabling environment, which requires this multi-stakeholder collaboration. And again, very excited that the forum is supporting this initiative and being able to draw it to your attention. And then, as was mentioned before, very excited to also talk about the Cost of Capital Observatory that Ms. Warlick mentioned in her opening comments, which we were very appreciative of her taking the time to do so. So the Cost of Capital Observatory was launched September of this year. It's actually not only an initiative between the IEA and the World Economic Forum, but it's also with the Imperial College of London, ETH Zurich, and Accenture. It aims to address the obstacles associated with investing in renewable energy in emerging and developing economies by filling the absence of reliable data and improving the transparency on cost of capital data for clean energy investments in those emerging and developing economies. It helps to inform stakeholders about inherent risks and to develop commensurate risk mitigating mechanisms. It provides aggregated data that did not exist before, and it builds a greater understanding of what we're thinking is the 800 billion clean energy financing gap that exists between both developed and emerging and developing economies. So with the information that the Cost of Capital Observatory can provide, it really helps financiers, policymakers, multilateral institutions, and project developers to better develop collaborations that are going to help tackle the risk and lower the overall costs of these investments. So hopefully, as you walk away from this session today, you take these 3 initiatives as a data point as well. But without further ado, let me now welcome up the panel who is going to continue the conversation started by our 2 great opening speakers. If I could ask the panel members to please come up and sit down, that would be appreciated. So we are joined by, as we were with our opening speakers, a tremendous influential panel that are going to bring some incredibly useful, practical, and new insights to the conversation, looking at how do we actually bring the reality of reduction of GHGs by 2030, right? Net zero, a new net zero to emerging and developing economies. Because there's a lot of talk that's been happening, and recollect that we're actually at COP27. I know it frequently has come to seem as if the COP is really not what it is, which is at its heart a policy discussion, right? We've got negotiators that are talking through some serious agreements as we are sitting here today. And so I would be remiss in not asking our panel the first question, which is, coming to the close of COP27, having participated in a number of conversations that I know you have, having heard some of the conversations that you have, what would you say is the number one policy focus or recommendation that you would give as we're now closing the negotiations here at COP27? What's the policy guidance? And if you could use your microphone, introduce yourself and your organization to give context to your recommendation or feedback, that would be appreciated. So let me pivot to my speaker on my left, since we'll go with the slides.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lesley Ndlovu, and I'm the CEO of the African Risk Capacity. The African Risk Capacity provides insurance solutions against extreme weather in Africa, floods, droughts, and tropical cyclones. Our two primary sectors are agriculture, but also renewable energy. And I would like to just spend a little bit of time talking about the role that insurance plays in the energy transition. So the first and maybe the most obvious point is around the investment portfolio. So the business model of insurance is that you collect premiums before you pay out claims. And in the intervening period, you can invest the premiums that you've collected. Over time, the insurance industry has built up a significant asset base. So obviously the first role that they can play is around investing their balance sheet in such a way that we support the acceleration to net zero. This is particularly relevant in the developing markets because there is an energy gap, or energy poverty as it's sometimes referred to. And that gap in the energy provided versus the energy required can be filled by renewables. And as the insurance industry, we can then support the investment into that. Maybe the second point, which is probably less obvious, is around the role of insurance in de-risking investments. So when you look at the emerging markets, one of the reasons that's cited as to why investment cannot flow into those markets is the high level of perceived risk, if I may say. But then there are already a number of de-risking instruments that are available. You can think about covers for political risk, against expropriation, against currency devaluation that you can take out. However, for us specifically at the African Risk Capacity, we're in fact involved in the minimum power production guarantees because we have expertise in modeling the weather, so we can structure a financial guarantee product for investors so that they avoid the penalties associated with the failure to deliver the minimum power. So again, the fear of investment in emerging markets shouldn't really be a factor in the decision making, because the insurance industry has developed a wide range of insurance products that effectively de-risk the investment. And then now coming back to the specific question that you've asked on the policy side. So the way we think about policy is that, in fact, what is required to be successful is a public-private partnership approach, because on the private sector side, we are very good at figuring out the financial solutions, but what is required to implement those financial solutions is an enabling environment, which is where then policy comes into play. And I will just highlight a few points in the interests of time. So the number one point would be that the way an insurance company invests its assets is driven by regulation. So you have, on the one hand, I think, very compelling speeches made about the need for acceleration to net zero, but this is not always accompanied by a coherent policy that supports investments into that sector. So my number one recommendation is really an alignment between what the aspirations are and what the regulatory requirements when it comes to investments should be. So I know you've asked for one recommendation, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for convening us for this really important discussion. So I think it was interesting when I was looking at your First Movers Coalition. I think the big policy conversations and questions that I've been hearing are really about that supply and demand, right? So spurring both the supply, whether that's creating investment frameworks, regulatory frameworks, pushes for that enabling environment for supply, but also the demand side so that there's a market. But within that, there are things around it and between it that I think I'm hearing a lot about too. In the in-between, I would say supply chains, security of supply chains. So what are those pieces that we have to build that are really hard to build because of supply chain constraints that we have right now? Whether it's the resources or the technologies, technology deployment is one thing, but there's actually supply chain constraints in terms of getting things at scale as well. And so talking about that. And then also the people-centered aspect of it. So the sustainable jobs, the transition aspect and the people, and engaging communities so that people are feeling the benefits of this transition. And so I guess I would say we are talking a lot about the beginning and end, like the supply and the demand, but the in-between and the people around it, I think, are a really important part of the conversation as well. Just to build on some of the things that Canada has been looking at in terms of those mechanisms, I think from a multilateral perspective, the conversations that are happening on standards and definitions are really important. You talked about procurement and that pull for demand in the market. I think the standards and conversations at the multilateral are really important on that. And I think some of the conversations at the IEA on heavy industry sectors have been really important with respect to that. I think multilaterally, our ability to pool expertise and funds is also really important to spur both demand and supply. On the Canadian side, just to profile some of the things we've been doing, you talked about the roadmaps for these difficult to decarbonize sectors. So we've launched roadmaps for a number. Just last week, we launched the Cement Association roadmap, and we're also going to co-lead on the Glasgow breakthrough work on cement and concrete. And again, really aligned with what you're talking about, our priority areas for cement are that market development, advancing innovation and deployment, and technology adaptation at scale. So I think it's very aligned with what you're talking about, but just in Canada, that's going to deliver 15 megatons in the next 6 or 7 years, and then 4 megatons annually after that. So it's not small. And then another thing we launched was the work on decarbonizing steel production, and we see 6 megatons of reductions by 2030 for that. And we have a number of funds. We have an innovation fund called the Strategic Innovation Fund, which is really helping with the deployment and demonstration of technologies. Clean fuels is one, but also hydrogen. We've also developed some investment tax credits for CCUS and hydrogen, which provide, on hydrogen, for example, we just announced an investment tax credit which would give up to 40% back of the initial investment for the lowest carbon intensity projects. But also another important part for us is we have a federal price, a national price on pollution. So we have a carbon price across all of our heavy emitting sectors. And we're advancing a work to ensure that we're future-proofing that, so that if people are investing in decarbonization and energy transition projects that are expensive, that are really important for these efforts, their investments are future-proofed. So they know what the trajectory is for the carbon price, but are also having contract for differences. So if ever there was an undoing of that carbon price for some reason, there's some certainty for those investors in terms of the value of those investments. So I think it's a mix of policies that are important for that, as well as an international conversation to make sure that we're standardizing, whether it's intensities or definitions, but also creating that pull from both supply and demand.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for inviting me. Actually, I would like to take the discussion into a more profound level. The fact is that ever since Paris Agreement urged the 1.5 degree challenge, we are regressing on it. So when we're talking about decarbonization, we have to admit that we are not there on a global level, and we need to address the foundations and the roots of it. The fact of the matter is, even in part of the globe where there are policies, where there are funds, where there are technology, they are the least progressing with regards to decarbonization, right? So it's not an emerging or least developed countries. It's a global issue. And I'm sharing with you this cartoon that I had yesterday on a panel, because we have to address the foundation. The foundation is that our accounting is very archaic. It's very much the remnant of the 20th century that did not account for externalities. The resources are not factored into our business model, and this is still the case. The other thing is education. Education still, I mean, if you have a sustainable development course, it's an add-on. It's not integrated into the curriculum. So the foundations of our system are still very much retro, the remains of the 20th century. That's why we'll never be there. This being said, so it's not policy. Believe me, it's not policy. From where I come in Egypt, we have witnessed real cases, on-ground cases, whereby once the externalities are internalized, the client is there and very much enthusiastic about decarbonization, and it has a win-win scenario for the bank. I mean, I can figure out or identify 3 corporates in Abu Qir for cement. They decarbonized, and it was a very profitable investment. And I think why? Because now the resources are starting to have cost. They did it because of the business case, not because of policy, neither because of regulations. And they achieved something like 17 million savings in 17 million tons in carbon emission savings. Another point is the cement, which is subsidiary of Suez Cement, subsidiary of Heidelberg. They did the same thing, and they invested $20 million for waste heat recovery. So I can mention several cases on our portfolio where the client started to figure out that it's much more cost efficient, and it would trickle down into his single bottom line if he decarbonizes. And this is the way to go. Decarbonization, or the business case, will take a policy, will take market dynamics, because even if the government doesn't move, there are other factors. I mean, now resources have a price, whether the governments admit it or not, whether policies are there or not. So And sometimes it's the governance of the institution itself. For example, Commercial International Bank, we joined the Net Zero Banking Alliance as a founding signatory, although it was not mandated by the government. Actually, we were going somehow against the government because we have investors, we have a business case. So let us be very clear. If we want to address this matter in a profound matter, it's the education and it's accounting. And until this takes place, it's the business case for each bank and each company. If you start to internalize water, carbon, now it has a pricing. The business case will be there, and this is where I lobby for emerging countries to decarbonize. It's not because it's a commitment, and this is my discussion with my colleagues at the Net Zero Banking Alliance. It's not a commitment for 2050. If you see the business case, you will do it before 2025. Thank you.
Wow, very good previous speech. And I think I agree with most of what was said here, but let me introduce myself first. I think that I am the only company representative here. I work for Vale, one of the largest mining companies in the world. I am the head of sustainability. And well, we think we need all the hands on deck to make it happen. We need the policy framework, we need the value chain, we need the finance, how we are dealing with it. So like from inside out, the movement is get to know yourself, understand your impact, set your goals, be transparent about it, make them part of the culture and not responsibility of a department. We need the company to drive a change, you know? So I am the head of sustainability. I always say that I am a biodegradable professional, okay? One day I have to disappear because the social and environmental lens has to be embedded in the way that we do everything in this company, right? But you need to create the tools to make it happen. For instance, you make me to remember, we set an internal carbon price that has been orienting our capital allocation, our product portfolio, you know. And last week, the head of our operations in Indonesia, Febriani, she was here, and she shared with the public that she has just approved a project that used to be based on coal. In using the carbon internal price, she was able to convince the company, you know, to already start it, use transition fuels, okay, at this moment. So it really helps you to drive for the change. You need to create equipment, you need to make it part of the culture, you need to have a very good relationship with your value chain. We, as a mining company, I mean, our scope 3 is our biggest challenge, okay? 98% of our emissions comes out of our customers. So we have now the responsibility to come up with new products. We have just launched the green briquette that helps them to reduce around 10% of their emissions. We have to look for higher quality iron ore because also reduce their emission. So you need to be able to really get their pressure on your business as well. So another important point is innovation. My recommendation for next year, if this is the year of implementation, next year we should be here showing breakthroughs, you know, showing really good cases that can be shared with the different sectors to scale up. Because what I have been learning is that sometimes you find a good model or a good technology, but guys, to scale up, it's not easy. Right? We have operate throughout the world. So you do good here, but then when you think about that you have to transport it, it kills, you know, the whole thing. So how to work on it, that's quite a challenge. And my recommendation is that what I have been seeing here these days is a lot of social issues being put on the table beyond just transition. In our case, we are contributing, one of our goals is to lift 500 people, 500,000, 500,000 people out of extreme poverty, right? It is happening. This extreme poverty exists before talking about climate change. So it's about conveying agendas, it's going beyond the just transition. So I hope to see next year much more integration about the debate on climate and people.
So this has been, remember the question was just, what would you give as a policy recommendation? And this panel has been challenging in saying it is, you can't de-link policy from finance, and you actually have to think about risk in the context of de-risking investments. You hear the voice of policy. It's not about policy. It's about education. It's about making the business case, and the business case is being made now. You hear about supply chains and something that's very close to both my program, but to me professionally, which is the power of the purchaser and procurement. And the fact that we're talking about bringing clean, innovative technologies, right? We've talked a lot about that, many, many COPs. But what about if you bring the technologies, who's going to buy? How do we prepare them to buy? Where is the capital available to invest, but also to buy? Most organizations don't provide new innovative technologies because it's a good thing to do. They tend to need to have a business case and a purchaser at the other end. And then there is the conversation about internally, organizationally, what do we need to do? And more importantly, that we don't distract as we have these conversations about the people impact and the social impact. So that's a lot for opening comments. But we are here at the closing days of the COP, right? And we've heard from our panelists here that this is an interplay between policy, private sector, financiers, insurers, and we're talking about not just actually emerging and developing economies. This is a global problem that we need to address. So we have the bully pulpit. We have the ability to give a what do we do after tomorrow ends, right? The formal closing happens, and we're already positioning then ourselves to a COP28. What do we make sure that we achieve next year? Because I don't know about all of you, but I've gone to many of these, and we're running out of time for the impact we need to have. We understand how essential it is to leverage clean, innovative technologies globally to transformatively decarbonize, especially the harder to abate sectors that we're focusing on, that we all rely on, that all industry relies on, right? Talk to me about a company that isn't using a particular material or using long-range transportation to move people or product. So we know we've got to do that. So let's imagine we have the final say. We can say, okay, this is what really needs to happen. Pretend that you have behind yourself all the governments. They're listening to you. Think that you have financial resources that you just need to direct. You have organizations, private industry, who's just waiting for you to say, this is what needs to happen, and they will make it happen. Wouldn't that be a perfect world? But let's just imagine that. So what is the guidance that we do? What's the practical thing for next year that if we don't get that done, let's not even consider a COP28? With that, who would like to start first?
I will start. I will tell you, I don't need governments. I need decarbonization technology to be mainstreamed and democratized. That's it. If we have the decarbonization technology, as a bank, we'll be able to demonstrate the business case for our client, which is already taking place, and the transition is taking place. We have a vested interest to decarbonize our portfolio as risk management and as revenue generation. So it's decarbonization technology to be mainstreamed across the world as soon as possible. It's very elitist so far.
May I complete?
Next.
Okay. Everything you said, plus people-centric, nature-positive. So good, proven technologies, okay? Decarbonizing, people-centric, and nature-positive.
I agree with everything that's been said, and I think a range of technologies, a range of decarbonization technologies. I think what I've been so impressed with this implementation COP is the participation of companies that are on this panel, companies that are in this audience. And I know that has been controversial for some, but I think it's really important to have the implementers, to have the innovators here talking about the challenges and the solutions alongside the communities. We have a significant portion of our Canadian delegation which is representing Indigenous communities in Canada. Talking about nature-forward solutions, we're very much supporting looking at sustainable critical minerals development. Those minerals that are really essential to developing some of these technologies that are required, these decarbonization technologies that are required. We have to think about not just the energy transition aspects, but reclamation, engagement with communities, jobs and prosperity that comes with it. So it really has to be a whole of ecosystem approach, and those ecosystems include people. So it's the technology, but it's also the engagement.
Closing comment.
So, well, the advantage of going last is that I'm obliged to agree with my fellow panelists, but maybe just to add a few thoughts, right? We've had a lot of discussion around moving from ambition to action, but all of us in the business world know that what gets measured gets done. So the ambition shouldn't just be conceptual, as has been said. At least on my part, within my span of control, what I'm going to be tracking is then the megawatts of energy from renewable energy sources that my own organization is enabling. And when I come to COP, the number for 2023 should obviously be higher than the number for 2022.
I like that, very practical goal myself. So with that, I want to thank our panel. If I could ask you to remain here, we still have a closing speaker. As I mentioned in the introduction, we are super excited to have the CEO of Hitachi Energy, who's going to not only build upon all that was here stated on the panel, but more importantly, we talk about policy, we talked about private sector, we talked about finance, but really what is the technology perspective that is necessary to actually bring a net zero future to us globally. So with that, if I may welcome up.
Thank you, and great panel discussion. It's going to be more than 5 minutes if we want to summarize all the great points made. What I really like also of this panel is that it's across stakeholders. Some perspectives, of course, from some of the industries that need a lot of technology to decarbonize, but also on the financial side and on the insurance. Because there is an important part, what I would like to start with is technology is not really the bottleneck as we see it. And I'm not saying this because I'm leading one of the technology providers that act globally in this space. It is because when we engage with all the stakeholders across the sectors, there is always an opportunity to push, to innovate, and to get the technology that is needed. But what is the next step that we need to do, and I think this is the great forum to kickstart that, is to innovate and change the way we collaborate so that we can deploy that technology that today is available and can deliver a lot, maybe not yet everything, but a lot of these decarbonization targets. I would like to pick up on some points just to lead into the technology aspect. Mary mentioned capacity, and it was also mentioned on the supply chain by Rachel. Capacity in some of the key technologies, it's already today there, whether it's the existing one, of the pipeline, of, for instance, building solar panels to meet the ambition of net zero by 2050. There is other areas, like for instance on lithium, where of course more needs to be done. And that's where then we need to come in from an innovation standpoint, from a technology standpoint, working more into the circularity of those resources, making sure that with innovation, with technology, we can drive the reuse of those resources that are needed to deliver the net zero. I think it's also important to remind that in that case, when it comes to we can close the gap on capacity, we need to address stronger and in a different way the whole aspect of financing, and we heard some of those aspects also during the panel. Eric mentioned that there is no credible path to the 1.5 degrees limit, and I would like to push back on that. I think we should not, out of this COP, we should not give up the target. It is going to get harder and harder. We have to acknowledge that. We need to create the awareness, but as a pioneering technology leader in many areas of this energy equation, it is up to us to keep that target alive. And there is a lot, once again, that we can do with what we already have today. Nancy, you mentioned, of course, the First Mover Coalition, and there, as we're also part of that initiative, just look at the slide that she showed. Steel, cement, two of the harder to abate sectors. Technology was yellowish, if I well remember, but what was red was financing, what was red for infrastructure, investment in the infrastructure, and what was red also was the policies. And I do believe that we need, yes, there is a lot of business cases that make their way without special intervention on policy. But if we want to scale that technology, if we want to scale it at the speed that is needed to deliver the 2030 targets, the 2050 targets, we need also to work in an innovative way and challenge ourselves on what is it that we need to do from a policy, from a regulatory standpoint, to deliver the scale, to deploy the technology on time. Lesley, I love your idea of combining both the investment from the insurance part as well as de-risking. And I think there is a great opportunity there. We have to also allow ourselves to understand that the risk profile in, for instance, countries in Africa, yes, might be higher from an investment standpoint, but at the same time, it is also clear that it's cheaper, and in certain cases, way cheaper to decarbonize and to take out 1 ton of CO2 investing in Africa as opposed to investing in more mature markets and economies. So I think we have to create also that awareness and push for that aspect. It's a great point, education and accounting, and I would stress as a technology provider, education. Education, there are some challenges in order to debottleneck the supply chain, and we're working on that. But on the medium to long term, we all of us here as stakeholders, we have to work, invest more, collaborate to create the talent pool and to build the talent pool that is required to deliver that technology. And that's not just the talent pool in engineering. It's also talent pool across all these sectors that is needed in order for everyone to understand what it takes to deliver and what it takes to have an integrated, holistic planning approach. We need to become much better understanding what the challenges are on the other side of the fence. And that's something that we need to do as a technology provider. We need to better understand the needs of our customers, the needs of the governments, the needs of the policymakers. And the same would go for them as well. It is important that we spend more time, and this is one of those great opportunities, so that we can explain better what technology can do not only today, but in the near future, so that the policymakers have that in mind when they design the policies and the regulatory aspects. Last but not least, it's together for implementation. That's COP27. The feedback I gathered in the last couple of days is that there is a lot of good momentum. I think we're turning the page from negotiating and planning into how can we then collaborate and execute. So to closing, in my view, it's technology is there. That's not the bottleneck. We will continue to innovate. We don't need policies to continue to push and invest in innovation, but we do need policy, we do need collaboration, we need everyone on board to drive the scale and the speed that is needed. We need to act together, and we need to act now. And by the way, let's not forget also, I learned that this week we are 8 billion people in this planet, and I think everyone out there has an opportunity to contribute, but particularly this forum here has a task, a commitment to take, and make sure that everyone understands that the clock is ticking and the entire world is watching. Thank you.
Well, with that, we've come to the closing time of our discussion today. I hope that you appreciated the thoughts that were shared by our two opening speakers. Tremendous conversation by our panelists. Thank you all for the time that you've taken to engage in the different perspectives that you raised. Obviously, thanks very much to our closing speaker in bringing that incredible call to action as a closing conversation. So thank you very much, you audience. For those of you who've been watching us live streamed, appreciate your time and attention. And go ye forth, do good work, make COP27 matter. So with that, thank you very much.